Welcome to Mind Tricks Radio, where we'll explore contemporary topics in psychology through interviewing creative and innovative thinkers in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Thanks for tuning in. We're here today with Dr. Patricia Zurita Ona, a clinical psychologist in the Bay Area. She received a PhD in clinical psychology at the Wright Institute, and she specializes in acceptance and commitment therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Her work is dedicated to helping her clients get unstuck from ineffective playing it safe moves and anxiety-based reactions so they can live the life they want. She is the founder of the East Bay Behavior Therapy Center, a boutique therapy practice where she offers therapy, coaching, and focused interventions based on acceptance and commitment therapy and contextual behavioral science. Dr. Zurita is the author of 7 books, co-author of 2, and has been nominated as a fellow of the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science for her contributions to the dissemination of acceptance and commitment therapy and the treatment of unworkable behavioral patterns. Patricia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Aaron. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, it's great to meet you in person after watching your amazing TEDx talk on playing it safe moves and hearing your great story about the coffee maker and drinking coffee. And here we are drinking coffee as we're doing this interview. It's great to finally meet you in person.
It's lovely. I have listened to different episodes of your podcast. I love your style. I love how you dive into different topics of psychology. So I am sure this is going to be a fun chat.
Well, thank you. So before we get started on the topic we're discussing today about playing it safe moves, I always like to spend a little time getting to know my guests a little bit better. And if we could take a few moments to talk a little bit about you and your background, where you're from, and some things about how you chose to become a psychologist and get involved with the work you're doing, that would be a great way to get to know you.
As you can hear, I have an accent. I am originally from Bolivia, South America. I, I grew up there, so I have strong roots with Bolivian culture, of course. And I was born in the midst of a dictatorship. My country was in the dictatorship at the time I was born, and I witnessed 2 more dictatorships after that. Um, I did not witness violence firsthand. However, I did witness very early how fear and anxiety can shape collectively people's behaviors. I have many memories of how people were very concerned about doing anything that could put them in danger or could make them feel unsafe. So I very early I witnessed how, again, fear can narrow people's behavior, how people have to be very careful. And even though it makes sense, of course, when there is a military regime dictating everything you do, of course, it's adaptive to be careful with your safety. However, sometimes people develop extreme hypervigilant behaviors, right? And that's the challenge with anxiety, with fear, that can become so chronic, so persistent, so pervasive that we don't realize becomes a way of being on the world. So that was growing up, and it was a very rich experience in many, many aspects. I feel very grateful for every childhood memory I have. And in high school, I started taking philosophy classes. And I remember reading this book, Crime and Punishment.
Ah, yes, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky.
That's right. It's a classic, right? And the main character, Rodon Romanovich Raskolnikov, was struggling deeply with moral dilemmas, anxiety, what's the right thing to do, what is correct, what is not. And I think Dostoevsky did an amazing job capturing the internal experience, the psychology of this person under massive amounts of distress. And it was that book actually that led me more into psychology and led me more into being curious and interested on the psychological landscape and the complexity of being humans that we all carry. So I went into psychology, starting with philosophy first, right? I started reading all the existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre, Kierkegaard, you name it. As I'm immersing myself into philosophy, I am becoming much more clear that psychology, it's really what I want to pursue. So that was an interesting shift for me, an interesting path.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting story. And I think we have something in common here because when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, Dostoevsky and Crime and Punishment, it was probably my favorite book. And it's definitely my top five favorite books of all time. So that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, right? I think it's one of those books that capture what means to be human, how we wrestle every single day, how we struggle with decisions, whether that is small decisions or big decisions, and how also we try to find meaning and purpose in anything we do. So it's a pivotal book, right? And I think there is a lot of links between psychology and philosophy, of course, right? That's just the history of these social sciences. But that was my I think my initiation into psychology. I think that I think of myself as a people person. I'm very curious about people. I am interested in what moves them, what drives them. So for me, it was very clear that maybe when I was around 15, 16 years old, that I wanted to be a psychologist. I wanted to be there working with people, learning with them and from them.
Yeah, and also I have to say, you come from an absolutely beautiful part of the world. I visited South America a few years ago with my family, and we were traveling in Ecuador and Peru, and we actually made it all the way to Lake Titicaca, which is very close to Bolivia, obviously. And
Wow.
unfortunately, I got COVID while I was there, so I couldn't go to Bolivia.
No.
That sort of put an end to the trip at that point until we continued traveling in Peru. But I was really disappointed, but absolutely gorgeous in that part of the world.
Oh no, thank you. That's incredible you were down there. I think Bolivia is a very magical country. If you are curious about the intersection of raw nature, pristine nature, and some urban centers, it's just the place to go, right? I think the culture is very rich, and we share Lake Titicaca with Peru. So there is the Bolivian side and the Peruvian side. They are both very, very different. One is more developed than the other one. But when I think of Bolivia, it's just so magical to be down there. I go home every single year. I'm grateful I can do that. And there are many parks and many areas where you go. Let me say this again. There are many parks and many areas that when you walk into them, it feels like you are the first person who is there because it's so rich. The nature is so rich that it really grasps your attention there. So I highly recommend to everyone listening to us to take a look to Bolivia and hope you guys can make it soon.
Thank you, Patricia. So I am definitely going to make it down to Bolivia at some point. I have to go back. It's just so gorgeous and beautiful there in the Andes. And I'm sure that Bolivia is just an amazing country as you described it. So, pivoting a little bit, let's talk about anxiety. Now, you are a clinical psychologist, you're a clinician, and you see many patients who suffer from anxiety and end up in your office. And I'm just wondering, how are you seeing people presenting with anxiety these days? And are there any particular patterns that are standing out for you that you're noticing in your practice?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I think of anxiety as part of our common humanity. I think that every single day that we are alive, there is going to be some form of worry, fear, of anxiety shaping our behaviors. I think from the moment we open our eyes to the moment of we're asleep, we are going to experience some form of anxiety. It just happens that when we respond to anxiety as something that we have to get rid of, we have to minimize, we have to avoid, we have to ignore, then anxiety becomes a problem. So in my practice, I provide therapy and coaching services for anyone struggling with any types of anxiety, whether that's perfectionist, procrastination, social anxiety, productivity anxiety, performance anxiety, panic, worry, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, you name it. In the work that I do, we work with clients who are 5 years old to the 50-year-old person still with some fear about taking a plane or fears of public speaking, you name it. So to answer your question, I think anxiety is everywhere because it is part of our common humanity. It just happens that if we don't have the psychological skills to deal with it effectively, it can really become a terrible problem, an obstacle in our life. And so that's in a nutshell a little bit what I can say. In terms of patterns, I think that's a very interesting question. Um, because I think we have been told that our anxieties are separated from each other. You can have a phobia, you can have fears of abandonment, you can have perfectionism. But in reality, I think if we look at our own life, our anxieties don't travel in isolation. They travel coexisting with each other, shaping each other, and they are shifting as our life and circumstances change as well. So I am a big proponent that we have to think of anxiety again as a collection of experiences that are hard for all of us. And research also has shown that. Research has established for the last 20 years that there is sort of a lot of comorbidity among different types of anxieties. So the patterns in general are more related to how people respond to anxiety. Some people will engage into massive amounts of situational avoidance. If you're afraid of giving a speech, if you're afraid of interviewing, you may avoid applying for a job, you may avoid giving a presentation in public, you name it. There are some people also that engage in other responses that are more private. They're engaging in rumination. They are replaying in their mind past mistakes that they did, or they're anticipating terrible scenarios. No one is going to like me. They're going to think I'm an idiot. So I think the patterns that we see are more based on how people respond to the anxiety they are dealing with. And as you hear in the TEDx talk, that's what I call playing it safe moves, which academically are known as safety behaviors.
Yeah, so this concept of playing it safe moves, I know that was the topic of your TEDx talk and a big part of your presentation about the work that you do. Let's dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that is helpful to clarify what is a safety behavior, what is a playing it safe move. See, here's the idea. Every time we experience anxiety, we are compelled to do something. No one wakes up and says, I am excited to be anxious today. I'm super happy to be anxious today. We don't like feeling anxious. And in general, humans, we don't like to experience discomfort. So what we do all types of things to minimize, get rid of, suppress, replace anxiety. Those responses can be very observable, can be overt, right? Or it can be very private. But all those responses are named safety behaviors. A safety behavior sounds very serious to me, so that's why I like to talk about playing it safe. So, playing it safe behaviors or playing it safe moves or safety behaviors are responses to manage and deal with anxiety that feels uncomfortable. Um, Now, it is important to clarify that, of course, sometimes playing it safe is the right thing to do. Sometimes can be very adaptive. The example I will have is that if I am walking on the street and I'm walking with my child that is 5 years old and I see a car driving really fast, I am going to be anxious. I'm going to be anxious about something happening to my kid. So I may hold my kid quickly. That is a safety behavior. It's very adaptive in that situation, right? Um, However, it wouldn't be adaptive if I want to apply for a new job. It's important for me to disseminate science, but I am afraid of being judged as an idiot, and I convince myself that I shouldn't apply to this. That safety behavior is not adaptive. So that's to say that we all play it safe, but our safety behaviors are going to define the quality of our life. Sometimes it can be adaptive, and sometimes it can really shrink our life. So we have to be paying attention to that consequence of playing it safe.
Yeah, so anxiety is kind of interesting, right? Because it does serve a purpose. It's part of our psychobiology for a reason.
Yeah,
It obviously, we need to be able to feel some anxiety or stress when there's an actual danger. And back in prehistoric times, when there were saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths, we needed to be able to respond to those kind of dangers. And the anxiety probably motivated us to be able to mobilize our internal resources and run or fight back or whatever.
that's
But
right.
over the thousands and thousands of years, humans have evolved a frontal lobe and we've developed executive functioning, and we have the ability to be able to say whether or not the actual danger is really dangerous, or if it's our anxiety mechanism is getting triggered when there's no actual real danger to us, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that that's difficult because sometimes it's hard for people to distinguish what the difference is between the proportion of how dangerous something is to the actual danger. So, my question for you is, how do people tell whether or not the danger is a real danger, or the thing that they're fearing is something that they actually need to fear, or whether it's blown out of proportion? And in other words, when the responses, the behaviors that people have to the perceived threat is adaptive, or when they are implementing playing it safe move when it's actually not working in their best interests. How do you distinguish the difference between those two things?
Yeah, I am smiling as you're asking that question because that's a question I get a lot. How do we know? How do we know when it's adaptive, when it's not? As you know, I'm a practitioner of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which is an evidence-based approach that has over hundreds of randomized clinical trials, and its effectiveness has been established for many psychological struggles. So within this particular framework, within ACT, we invite people to think about what we call workability. Workability basically is looking at whether your responses to any type of internal experience that is uncomfortable takes you farther away from your values or closer to your values. So, for example, I love to speak about the application of ACT to anxiety-based struggles because of my own personal history, because of the work I do, but because also I believe that these psychological skills can be so transformative in a person's life. And I can speak that, from firsthand experience. For me, learning ACT skills has been extremely transformative. In some way, I could say my life before ACT skills and my life after ACT skills, right?
Yeah.
When
Hmm.
I when I think about my own fears. So it is possible that, of course, when I'm giving a big talk like a TEDx talk you saw and you watch, it's very anxiety provoking. Yeah, all the elements of giving a TEDx talk can be really scary, right? It's a very rigorous process, right?
Yeah, nerve-wracking, terrifying for a lot of people to do public speaking like that. You're really courageous and brave to do that, by the way.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It was worth it. It was worth it. But when you walk into the stage, you have these humongous lights on your face, right? All there, and it can be a little bit disoriented, right? For the first 2, 3 minutes, and your mind tells you all types of things. Oh my gosh, you're going to make a fool of yourself. Why you're doing this? You shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
So for me, sometimes, not all the time, when I'm giving these large talks, my mind, of course, tell me all types of blah, 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 chop, 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 right? If I listen to those thoughts and I take those thoughts as the absolute truth, I wouldn't be giving any talk. I wouldn't have said yes to this podcast interview, right? I could have tell you, it's not my thing, right? Thank you so much, but I am just too busy, right? I wouldn't have applied to me to give a TEDx talk. So when I look at my value is dissemination of active skills for anxiety. But if I avoid what is triggering to me, we will say that that behavior is not workable because it takes me farther away from doing something that is very important to me. But when I'm giving the talk, when I am participating in these interviews, even though it can be tricky, it can be time consuming, I can be a little bit anxious, right? It is a behavior that takes me closer to how I want to be. I want to be a person that expresses the word about ACT skills for anxiety. So workability is around examining and looking at the impact of our behaviors in regard to our values. So that is why when I think about the TEDx talk, it was absolutely nerve wracking for sure from the beginning to the end. But it was absolutely worth it. And I will do it again and again and again.
Yeah, and I think that's actually it's a really good example because if you think about it, preparing to do something like that, to do a TEDx talk or a big public speaking event, and you were anticipating, like, I'm going to go up there, I'm going to be on stage, there's going to be all these bright lights, all these people listening to me. What if I mess up? It's very anxiety and stress inducing. And I just tell myself, God, who needs this kind of stress? Who needs it? I'd rather just stay home, make a nice second cup of coffee, pet my cat, sit on the couch, relax. That's a lot more pleasant than getting on that stage in that hot spotlight and having to do this presentation. But obviously, you're saying to yourself, going up and doing that, despite the fact that it's likely to be uncomfortable for me and a lot less comfortable for me than if I stayed home and played it safe, is more in alignment with my values. And I'm actually doing something that I'll feel really good about later.
That's
So
right.
it's worth it. Even though it's uncomfortable, it's worth it to me. So I think it's really important to recognize that sometimes what it ends up being best for a person is not necessarily what's going to be the most comfortable thing for them at the time. And I think that's pretty courageous, actually, as I said before, to make the choice to do something that's in alignment with your values rather than playing it safe, which is, I think, a big part of your message.
That's right. That's right. You're tapping into something important. Within ACT, we teach clients skills based on six psychological processes, based on the hexaflex. One of these components is values. It's really exploring what really adds meaning to our life, who we want to be in the world, how we want to show up to the people we care about, how we want to relate to our bodies. And one of the things that has happens is that there is a huge difference when you acknowledge that anxiety is part of your life versus when you look at situations in which being anxious is worth it for you. Um, Hundreds of years ago, I was working with a client with fears of driving on a bridge, driving on the freeway. And things happen in life, and my client made a choice of driving over the bridge in San Francisco because that was the only way that could visit his mom who was in the hospital, who ended up in the hospital. So it was that value of being present there with his mother that helped him to engage in this behavior that was very, very scary. So I think that in life, living our values, it's not as easy as it looks. It's not flowers and butterflies. It's actually all about what you were saying. It's bravery, it's courage, it's facing our feelings right on the face. It's saying yes to what feels so uncomfortable in the service of having a rich life. And that's not easy at all. I think it's hard work.
Yeah, and let's take a look at the other side of this, like maybe in your clinical practice, for example, people
Yeah.
who you find are complaining that they're playing it safe more times than not. How do they usually show up? Do they have particular kinds of psychological distress, existential crises? Are they
Yeah.
depressed? Like, how does that present itself when people are playing it safe and kind of aware that this is how they're living their life?
That's a great question. So one way to think about this is going back to two notions of what is primary pain or secondary pain. Sometimes people call it clean pain or dirty pain. But just to this translate basically in our experience and our responses to anxiety. When we feel anxious, when we have a panic sensation, when we get scared, that's unavoidable. That's being human. That's very uncomfortable, but it's primary pain. It's unavoidable pain that we all are going to experience. But when I go into always suppressing my fears, always trying to replace my anxiety with something positive, when I go to avoiding situations that can be too anxious to me, then I'm going to feel sad, depressed. If I manage my anxiety by drinking alcohol or drinking a scotch or getting high all the time, I'm going to feel the consequences of developing a pattern of using substances. So all that is what we call secondary pain. And To your question, I think the challenge with anxiety, the biggest thing is that people start living inauthentic lives, lives that lack meaning, lives that lack joy, because anxiety by nature is going to narrow your repertoire. It will shrink every single thing you do. Because at some point, your mind is going to tell you, oh, it's scary if you leave the house. It's scary if you have that hard conversation. Watch out if you upset your friend. So avoidance is the most common response to anxiety. But with anxiety, the price that we pay is to live inauthentic lives. So that's, I think, the hardest thing that I have seen people, and over the last 18 years working as a psychologist, I have seen many people really suffering because their responses to anxiety has reduced their lives little by little. We want to be careful with that.
I imagine that many people are suffering and coping with some level of depression around this, like either major depressive disorder or a low-lying dysthymic kind of disorder, just sort of feeling not good about how they're living the life, not in an authentic sort of way, and just not feeling so great about themselves. So I imagine they must manifest like that in some ways.
And I think that's also what happens, that people know when something is it's not working in their lives, right? But facing your anxieties, your fears is a hard thing. But I think answering your question is one of the hardest things when you see wonderful people, wonderful human beings, very interesting, very smart, very kind, very generous, but with a repertoire in their life that is very narrow. They don't have many friends, they don't have many connections, they are not doing activities that are important to them. Their life has been organized around avoiding being anxious, avoiding things that makes them anxious. So that's a really, really hard thing to witness in life and to experience that.
Yes, it sure is. So, Patricia, I'd like to talk with you about this intriguing concept that you've labeled the advisory board.
Mm,
I guess the
mm.
advisory board that takes up residence inside one's head and gives advice, whether it's good advice or not such great advice. But it's an intriguing concept and it's a great title. Can you tell us a little bit about this advisory board and how that fits into this context of the playing it safe moves we've been talking about?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. That's a very sweet question. No one has asked me that. Thank you so much. And so when I was working on the TEDx talk, as you know, you only have 70 minutes, 14 to 17 minutes, and they are very strict. Right, you cannot go 70 minutes and 2 seconds. No, it has to be 70 minutes. And and I was thinking, how can I convey the application of active skills for anxiety, the active skills for safety behaviors? So I knew I needed to share a story because that's what I think translates many of these psychological concepts. I also wanted to share something personal, my own one of my anxious moments, because I have a collection of them in my life, right? So share the story about indecision regarding a coffee machine. But as when you're thinking about this talk, also I wanted to give people some concrete ways of looking and hearing how ACT skills can be applied. And one of the things that ACT does a lot is guiding us to have a different relationship with our mind. A relationship in which we become observant of our thoughts, a relationship in which we can look at our thoughts on the distance versus quickly acting on them versus quickly responding to them, right? There's different psychological processes really focused on that, like contact with the present moment, diffusion, mindfulness. But the idea here is that you can learn to notice that your mind is part of who you are, but it doesn't have to dictate your behavior. You can learn to watch your thoughts as letters, words, and images put together. And so I was playing with different metaphors to capture that. An advisory board at that time felt like one of those ideas that can capture that the mind, it's not our enemy. It's never working against us. It's always trying to protect us as a very nagging friend. We all have friends that we say, like, I'm thinking about doing X. I'm thinking to travel to this place. Watch out, right? Don't do that. I remember a friend of mine years ago. I was having a conversation about traveling to Machu Picchu. And my friend said, I'm very happy for you, Patricia. I think you should go, but just make sure you don't die with pulmonary down there. I'm like, oh boy.
Right. Gee, thanks,
So
friend.
that's right. That's right. So we all have friends that are a little, they are on the nagging side, right? So our mind, as an advisory board, if we think about it, sometimes give us advice that can be very interesting, very helpful, and it's workable. Sometimes tell us things that are like, what? What did my mind say? Did I have a thought? So the advisory board captures the nature of having a mind that is always trying to protect us, sometimes in a very, very nagging and annoying way. But fundamentally, we also can acknowledge that the advisory board is never quiet. It's all the time going blah, 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 yap, 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 chop, 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 non-stop, right? Our task is to check, when do I listen to my advisory board and when I don't, right? Or which thoughts I'm going to choose to respond and which ones I'm not. Given that we have 1,000 types of thoughts a day, it's incredible, right? It's impossible that every single thought is going to be workable or helpful or is going to add meaning into our life. So we have to choose. All that to say that I think the advisor metaphor captures one of the big psychological processes of diffusion and perspective taking from the ACT model, which is learning to watch at your mind as another organ you have that has a life on its own. But you have it when you use to choose to respond to that in a way that expands your life, not shrink it.
Yes, right. And again, I think that advisory board metaphor is a really good one. And we have similar things to that, like in cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk about automatic thoughts or this idea of core irrational beliefs, this sort of buzz in the background of thoughts that you have that aren't necessarily the right ones or the true ones. It's one version of reality that you're thinking in the background. And I think it's really important just to acknowledge that just because you think something, it doesn't mean that thing that you're thinking is true, or that even if there's some aspects of it that might be true, it might not be in your best interests to follow that advice. So just because you think something doesn't mean that thing that you're thinking is the right thing. And I guess that's part of your task is to take a listen to everything that's going on inside your head, listen to that advisory board, and then decide for yourself whether or not that advice is in your best interests or not. So it's a great concept.
That's right. I think many models of psychotherapy have tapped into that, right? There is many mindfulness-based approaches. ACT is one of them, in which
Yeah.
we really have acknowledged that um, the classic models of trying to look at the mind as this dictator of what we do, they are not very effective because we're never going to win against our mind, right? The mind is all the time going to come with it coming up with a lot of thoughts and content. It's like playing a chess game sometimes with your mind, right?
Yeah.
And that is why accepting is a big skill also within ACT, because we have to accept fundamentally all the internal noise that comes in our bodies and our minds, the feelings that come in our way, instead of wrestling with them, trying to replace them, or checking what is true and what is not true, right? Because again, we're never going to win against our mind. We may have like mini battles in which something clicks and feels, okay, this is right, right? This study is correct, but it's going to be in an hour that the mind is going to come up with another thought, and another thought is going to question. So it's much more helpful, much more effective to look at the workability of thoughts. If I go along with this thought, is that going to expand my life or is that going to shrink my life? If I do exactly what this thought is asking me to do I become the person I want to be? Or do I get farther from my values? So those questions, looking at the workability again of our behaviors, is much more helpful in our everyday life and to deal with anxiety effectively.
So, Patricia, let's dig a little deeper into this idea of how to get unstuck from the playing it safe moves. And I know you talked about this important one of the mindfulness, which I know is a big part of ACT and, call it metacognition or just being more self-aware of your thinking. But that's obviously very important. If we don't know our thoughts, we're not aware of our thoughts, we can't change anything, or it's vitally important to be aware, of course. But after that, if we dig a little deeper, what is the next steps? How do people then go from being mindful to becoming unstuck? What's the process there?
if we are clear about how we're playing it safe and the things I'm doing in response to my anxiety to manage it, then the next thing will be to step back and ask the question, who I want to be in this life, what matters to me, who I want to be in this relationship, how do I want to relate to my health, um, what type of neighbor I want to be in my community. So it's really going to what we call values and engaging in a series of values-based exploration exercises. Um, I know that values is a very popular word these days. Everyone throws values here and there. Within ACT, we think of values as ongoing habits of actions. So we think of them as verbs. My value will be being caring, being compassionate, being connected. Because we think that in your day life, you cannot ever check off your values from your to-do list because you're always working towards them, right? If my value again is disseminating active skills, I'm never going to be done with that. There are particular tasks that I can check off from my to-do list, but the value of dissemination is always a guiding principle for me. If my value is being caring with my friends and with my relatives, there are different ways in which I can show caring. I can send them an email. I can ask them to go for dinner. I can be there when they are struggling. I can send them a sweet text from time to time, right? All those behaviors I can check off from my to-do list. But the value of being caring, I'm always going to be working to that. So it is important to step back and look again what is adding into my life, what matters to me. And then check, is this playing it safe move expanding or contracting? Is this playing it safe behavior helping me to be close to my values or not? Looking at the workability. The reason why this is important is because it is very common to get messages that to deal with your anxieties, you just have to face them, face your fears all the way, just do it. If it were easy like that, everyone would have done it. It's
Yeah.
actually hard. It is hard to make bold moves. It's hard to be
Yep.
courageous, right? So we want to have a foundation that helps us to say, I am willing to face my fears in the name of my values. That's a very different conversation with ourselves, a different way of being in the world. So that is why stepping back and look at what matters to me, what is who I want to be in this life. The next part will be checking how we are relating to our thinking. Are you one of those people that quickly responds to every single thought that pops up into your mind? Are you one of those people that tends to overthink stuff, right? You're anticipating things in the future. You're preoccupied with things that happened in the past. Are you a person that if the thought says you need to do this, you need to avoid this situation, you quickly go along with that? Because if so, you may want to try other exercises to really look how you can practice having those thoughts without doing anything. That sounds very, I don't know, that sounds very new edgy, I will say. But mindfulness perhaps is one of the ways that has teach us that we can become the containers of our thoughts, our feelings and sensations. So we have to start acknowledging that the mind has a life on its own, that not because we think it's true. For us, for you, for myself, because of the work we do, we get it, we live it, we breathe it. I think for people listening to us, it's a very counterintuitive thing many times. Like, what? I don't have to respond to my thoughts, but I'm thinking about it. It's important. Thinking a lot about something doesn't mean it's important. Thinking a lot about something, it's just pure noise many times, right? So it's checking really how we're relating to thoughts. And then we also have to check our willingness to say yes to the yuckiest stuff that comes with anxiety. Again, you have heard me saying this, but I think it's experience for most people. We don't like to be anxious. And it's not just humans, other species also don't like to experience anxiety and discomfort, right? So by nature, we're going to play it safe. But we have to check, am I willing to say yes to this sensation, to this feeling, to this anxious thought in the service of being the person I want to be? And that is such an individual question, an individual choice that we all have to check for ourselves and answer that in the moment. So knowing that being willing to face our anxieties, our fears and worries has nothing to do with how large is the step you take or how small is the action. It's about saying yes to your fears, full intention. So that's the next thing, managing effectively or getting unstuck from problematic playing it safe moves requires looking at your values, checking how you're relating to your thinking, checking how you're willing to experience anxiety, and then taking steps, taking actions. It doesn't matter if the action is small or is a big one. It's more about your intentionality. It's more about saying, I know when I'm driving on the freeway, I'm going to be, I'm going to have shortness of breath and I'm going to feel like pulling over. And I'm going to remind myself that I'm doing this because I want to visit my mom, because I want to be next to my mom as she's in the hospital. I know that my mind is going to tell me that I'm going to have a car accident. I'm going to watch the thought, take a deep breath, and continue driving. So, all that to say that getting unstuck, it is possible, but requires these micro skills for all of us. It's not just a one size fits all, and it's not about just do it, just go in the car and drive on the freeways, right? I think that can be quite scary for people. It's the opposite. It's really learning life skills to check what matters to you. How are you relating to your mind? How are you responding to your anxieties? Are you willing to say yes? And then which action you're taking with full intention, not with the agenda of getting rid of anxiety, but knowing that that action is going to come with anxiety as two sides of the coin, doing what matters with also the anxiety that comes with it.
So that's a really interesting and important way of looking at the treatment of anxiety and what we do with working with anxiety in a clinical setting is not to see anxiety, the goal to be completely ridding oneself of anxiety. Although, of course, that sounds nice. It's not realistic in most cases for
Yeah.
people to completely be anxiety free in every situation for the rest of their life. But I think the idea that realizing that one can overcome the limitations of anxiety, minimize the amount of anxiety they're feeling, hopefully, but whatever anxiety they continue to have is not limiting their ability to reach their goals and that they're in alignment with their values. And that's sort of a different way of looking at it than the goal being to just completely rid oneself of anxiety completely. Because I know that's a really daunting task. If somebody feels like in a clinical practice, they come in and they say, Doc, please get rid of all of my anxiety. It's a lot of pressure
I
for
know.
everybody to achieve a goal that's probably not realistic. But it is realistic for one to learn how to lower, minimize their anxiety, and then learn to live with the anxiety they have and overcome the limitations that that's causing. So I think that's really important. And I know in your practice, because we're talking so much about values here, I imagine that you must spend a fair amount of time when you're working with patients, especially in relation to the ACT model, which I know that you use quite a bit in your practice, spending time with your patients, identifying what values are important to them and how and in what ways anxiety might be limiting their ability to reach those values. So that's part of the clinical practice, I imagine, in your office is spending time with patients doing that.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. Let me just go back a little bit to what you say when you have your clients coming and saying, Doctor, I want to get rid of my anxiety. I want to be anxiety free. That's a really good point because yes, I have heard the same thing, right? I have heard the same thing for years. Um, And I think the challenge is that we have been exposed to the idea, to these messages that anxiety is bad, that we shouldn't ever feel anxious, we shouldn't feel sad, that we shouldn't feel jealousy, that we shouldn't feel envy, that those are negative anxieties that we have to get rid of. So I think that has been part of the information era, right? And what happens with those messages is that are so embedded that they are denying again our common humanity. You have heard me saying this on the TEDx talk, and I say this many, many times in many ways. To be human is to be anxious. So I think part of the work that we are doing is normalizing that no human being, no excellent therapist is going to help anyone to get rid forever from anxiety, right? That's impossible, right? That's impossible.
Yes,
So I think it's really, right? It's really, we
impossible.
cannot do that. We're
Right,
not
impossible.
magicians. It's impossible. We're not magicians, right? Uh, Not even with the help of artificial intelligence, we're going to be able to do that.
Patricia, I'd like to ask you a question that I ask a lot of guests, especially ones who come on and talking about anxiety and the treatment of anxiety. And it's a fairly common thing that comes up in clinical practices. I'm sure that you've seen it many times before in your practice. And that is, as clinicians, I know we're always trying to work with our clients to have them take risks, step outside of their comfort zone, talk back to that advisory board, try different things, new things. And oftentimes the results are great for the patients, right? They have a good experience and it helps them reframe the way they think about how they're approaching the world and how they're approaching themselves. But sometimes the experience doesn't go so great. They step outside of their comfort zone, they take a risk, and they're not super happy with the result. It doesn't go the way they'd like it to go, and they're not satisfied with it. So, what do you say in those situations with patients who come back and they say, Doc, I tried what we talked about and it didn't go so great? What do you do in that situation?
That's a great question. That's a great question, Aaron. I think in the work I do, I don't jump into pushing people to face their fears right away. It's important for me to create this foundation, right, of some of these skills that we have discussed here. But also, as we are working in these micro skills to deal with playing in safe moves and to deal with anxiety, I talk a lot about the attachment that we have to how things supposed to be. We have attachment to the idea that I shouldn't feel anxious. We have attachment to the idea that I will only be happy if I'm not anxious. I will only be happy if I don't have this panic sensation on my chest. I will only be happy if I don't make any error, if I don't fail in this particular project, right? So I think I invite my clients to check, are you holding into the thought like this, like very rigidly, or are you holding with openness and lightly? And holding with openness and lively means that I can notice a thought, I can watch the thought, I can let it be without making the source of, I need to do more, I need to do it, I need to make sure I don't make a mistake, right? So the thing is our attachment to outcomes and our attachment to how we're supposed to feel in a particular situation, to how things supposed to be, to add our suffering. So in my work, when we are practicing some of these values-based exposure exercises or acceptance exercises, I check again. We check what is the intention behind this exercise. Why are we willing to do this? Why it is important for you to do this when you know you're going to be anxious, when you know your mind is going to tell you all types of things? And all is this to help people to go back to really the goal here is values-based living. The goal is not to get rid of anxiety. So the frame in the context in which we guide our clients to face these fears is important. Uh, but yet, of course, sometimes some things, sometimes some things go wrong. Sometimes we have terrible outcomes. And for me, in the work I do, it is important to model curiosity for how things will go. We don't know. And in the work of I do, even though I believe that every person I work with is capable of managing their anxieties effectively and having joyful and rich lives, I'm also careful that I'm not this cheerleader saying everything is going to be fine, everything is going to work out great, right? Because we don't know. I am humble to say that we don't know. All what we can do is approach things with openness. But the thing is that when you approach things with openness, without attachment, you liberate yourself from using all your energy thinking and thinking about how to get to a particular outcome of managing your anxiety because you are more present, right? So the outcomes could be very different and really good in general, right? So I think when things go south, when things go well, I approach even those moments with curiosity, right? So, okay, what was hard for you about that? Okay, what did you notice? What did your mind tell you? What is your mind telling you now? I don't call on to those events as something tragic. It really means that in life, everything is trial and error. We don't know. We just don't know how things are going to go, right? Um, so that will be, I think, but the most important part is to create a frame for the context of change, right? This is not about just facing our fears right on just because. It's about checking why I'm doing, how I am doing, What is my intention behind this exercise? Knowing that even when I have my intentions and my commitment to this exposure exercise or to this acceptance exercise, I don't know how it's going to go. Right. So I think that will be, one way of thinking about this. What do we do when things go south? We approach them with curiosity, we approach them with kindness, we approach them with compassion, but we also approach them as part of being alive. Our fears and the outcomes of our actions don't come organized in a schedule. We never know how things are going to go. We just never know. It's a full uncertainty experience, right? So we also have to, remember that we don't have control. We don't have control of hundreds of things. We simply do our best by being clear with our values and taking steps in the service of who we want to be.
Right, Patricia, thank you. I think that's a perfect response, and I totally agree with you. And I think that most people would agree if they look back on their life and they look back at the decisions that they've made, most people would say that they would have regretted not trying and making an effort than trying and failing, because nothing's worse for people than to look back in their lives and say, I played it safe and I didn't try, and then I don't know whether or not things would have worked out for me or not. At least I tried, and now I don't regret having made the effort. I think most people would agree with that. And then if you try and you fail or things don't work out for you, then you can say, well, I did my best. I tried. It didn't work out this time. Sometimes it works
Yeah.
out, sometimes it doesn't, but you never know unless you try. So I think that's really important with this.
That is so true, Aaron. I think that it's our attachment to how things supposed to be
Yeah.
externally and internally that really adds a lot of software in our life, right? And many Buddhist philosophies have talked about this, right? But the other thing that is coming to my mind as you were talking is that um, research has found that when you are using active skills by engaging in values based behaviors, by facing your fears and anxieties in the service of who we want to be, people experience an improvement in the quality of their life. And also, they experience a reduction in their anxiety symptoms. So, in the past, ACT has been criticized about not working on the symptoms of a person's anxiety. But research has shown the opposite. When you help a person, when we guide clients to expand their life repertoire by helping him to face their fears, that also tackles, their anxiety symptoms. Because then they are not so preoccupied with this catastrophic thought, right? They're more present with experience of connection than the thought that is in their head, right? They're more present with experience of having an ice cream than the fear of contamination in the back of their mind, right?
Yeah.
So it is hard work. It's definitely hard work, but it's also very, very powerful. It's very, very impactful in a person's life.
Absolutely. Well, Patricia, this has been a really interesting and fascinating conversation about your ideas around playing it safe moves, around acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and this idea about values-based decision making and fear and avoidance and all that. I've been really had a fun time talking with you about all of this. You're clearly very, very well versed in these topics. I'm sure you're a fantastic, fabulous clinician, and you've written some amazing books. And so, thank you so much for the excellent work you do and for being here talking with me today. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if you could just leave us with any ideas. Do you have any last final thoughts you'd like to leave us with about this topic before we conclude?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you again for your kindness having me in your show. I think if I have to think about final words for this episode, I will invite every person listening to us to watch what their advisory board is doing in a given moment and to check, do I respond to the thought or do I let it go? If I respond to this thought, is it helping me to be the person I want to be, or is it take me farther away from my values? I think that will be the biggest message. I think in a nutshell is living at, in micro moments in our life.
Very wise words and very sage advice. Thank you, Patricia. And thank you so much for coming on Mind Tricks Radio. It's been a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron. It has been a true honor to be in your show, and I hope that with time we can do this again.
Oh, I'd love that. We definitely will. Thank you for listening to Mind Tricks Radio. I hope you have enjoyed the program. For more information about Mind Tricks, you can go to my website, www.waikikihealth.com. Be sure to subscribe to Mind Tricks on your preferred podcasting host to be notified of new episodes of Mind Tricks. Please take some time to give Mind Tricks a good rating and review wherever you are listening. It really helps get the word out to new listeners. And please like and share Mind Tricks posts on Twitter and Facebook by following your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan.